The Lord of Lusignan was everything a medieval nobleman should be. Wealthy, connected to the French royal court, owner of 3 castles and thousands of acres. When he married Catherine de Valence in 1310, everyone agreed it was a perfect match. She brought a massive dowry. He brought prestige and protection. The marriage contract took 6 months to negotiate, with lawyers arguing over every detail of inheritance rights and property transfers. Nobody bothered to check if the groom could actually perform his most basic marital duty. The wedding was spectacular. 3 days of feasting, hundreds of guests, musicians imported from Italy. Catherine was 17, considered beautiful by contemporary accounts, with land holdings that would make her husband one of the richest men in France. The bedding ceremony went exactly as planned. Witnesses escorted the couple to the chamber, blessed the bed, and left them alone to consummate the marriage that would unite 2 powerful families. Hours passed, then more hours. By morning, something was clearly wrong. Lusignan emerged from the bedchamber alone, his face twisted with rage. He didn't speak to anyone, just stormed to his private rooms and stayed there for 2 days. Catherine remained in the bedchamber, and servants who brought her food reported she was crying, but wouldn't explain why. The wedding guests, still lingering at the castle, started whispering. Had something gone wrong? Was the marriage invalid? On the 3rd day, Lusignan made an announcement that would destroy Catherine's life. He gathered the remaining nobles and family members in the Great Hall and declared that his wife was cursed. Not just cursed, but actively working against him through dark magic. According to Lusignan, Catherine had used witchcraft to prevent the consummation of their marriage. She had made herself impossible to penetrate through demonic intervention. The accusation was specific and calculated. Lusignan claimed that whenever he approached Catherine, his body would fail him. Not because of any weakness on his part, he insisted, but because she had cast a spell that made intercourse physically impossible. He described attempting to consummate the marriage multiple times over 3 nights, and each time being struck by a mysterious ailment that left him unable to perform. He even claimed to have found strange herbs under their mattress, evidence of Catherine's witchcraft. Catherine tried to defend herself, but medieval law didn't care much about a wife's testimony against her husband's accusations. Lusignan was a powerful lord with connections to the royal court. Catherine was a teenager whose family lived 3 days' journey away. She had no allies in his castle, no one who would risk contradicting a man of his status. But here's where Lusignan's plan revealed its true cruelty. He didn't just accuse Catherine of witchcraft in private. He demanded a formal ecclesiastical investigation. In medieval France, accusations of witchcraft required official church trials, complete with examinations, interrogations, and witness testimony. Lusignan knew exactly what he was doing. An investigation meant Catherine would be subjected to humiliating physical examinations by church officials and physicians. It meant her most intimate details would become public record. And if the church found her guilty, the penalty was death by burning. The investigation was scheduled to begin within the week. Lusignan made sure everyone knew about it. He sent letters to neighboring nobles, to church officials, to Catherine's own family. He wanted the entire region to know that his wife was a witch who had used dark magic to prevent their marriage from being consummated. He was setting up a narrative where his sexual failure became her supernatural crime. Catherine's family, upon hearing the news, sent frantic letters begging Lusignan to reconsider. They offered to return the dowry, to annul the marriage quietly, anything to avoid a witchcraft trial. But Lusignan refused every offer. He wanted a trial. He wanted Catherine examined, questioned, and publicly humiliated. Because if the church declared her a witch, then his inability to consummate the marriage would be explained as supernatural interference, not physical inadequacy. The truly horrifying part was that Lusignan had legal precedent on his side. Medieval law recognized maleficium, harmful magic directed at preventing sexual intercourse, as a legitimate ground for annulment and prosecution. Several cases existed of women being executed for allegedly using witchcraft to cause male impotence. Lusignan was using an established legal framework to cover up what was almost certainly his own sexual dysfunction. As preparations for the trial began, Catherine realized the full scope of what was coming. The investigation wouldn't just determine if she was guilty. It would involve physicians examining her body to look for evidence of witchcraft. It would require testimony about the most intimate details of her wedding night. It would expose her to torture if interrogators decided she wasn't being truthful. And at the end of it all, if the church agreed with Lusignan's accusations, she would be tied to a stake and burned alive. All because her husband couldn't get an erection and decided it was easier to kill her than admit the truth. The ecclesiastical court convened in Lusignan's own castle, which should have been the first sign that this trial was rigged from the start. The judge was Bishop Antoine de Valois, a longtime friend of the Lusignan family who had personally baptized the Lord's younger brother. The two court-appointed physicians were both on Lusignan's payroll. Catherine's family sent lawyers, but medieval law limited how much they could actually advocate for a woman accused of witchcraft. The trial was designed to reach one predetermined conclusion. The first phase involved Catherine's physical examination. Church law required that women accused of using sexual magic be inspected by physicians to determine if their bodies showed signs of demonic influence. What this meant in practice was that Catherine was taken to a private chamber where two male doctors, neither of whom she had ever met, conducted an invasive gynecological examination, while church officials observed and took notes. The examination was brutal and humiliating. Medieval medical knowledge about female anatomy was limited and wrong in almost every detail. Physicians believed they could identify a witch by looking for devil's marks, unusual moles, scars, or skin discolorations that supposedly indicated demonic pacts. They also believed that a woman's hymen could reveal whether she had engaged in witchcraft, based on theories that were both medically absurd and designed to blame women for male sexual failure. Catherine was stripped naked and placed on an examination table. The physicians spent over an hour inspecting every part of her body, looking for anything that could be classified as evidence of witchcraft. They measured her genitals, tested the temperature of her skin, and inserted instruments to check her internal anatomy. Every detail was recorded by a court scribe, who would later read these findings aloud in open court. The examination concluded with the physicians declaring that Catherine was perfectly formed and without abnormality. In other words, there was nothing physically wrong with her that would prevent sexual intercourse. The doctors even went so far as to state that based on their inspection, Catherine should be fully capable of receiving her husband. This should have been good news for Catherine. It proved she wasn't physically incapable of consummation. But Lusignan had anticipated this outcome. When the court reconvened and the physicians presented their findings, Lusignan immediately demanded that he also be examined. Not because he believed there was anything wrong with him, but because he needed to create the appearance of fairness. He spent 30 minutes loudly insisting that if Catherine had been inspected, then so should he, to prove that he was physically capable of performing his marital duties. The bishop agreed, and Lusignan was escorted to the examination chamber. But here's where the setup became obvious. Lusignan's examination lasted less than 10 minutes. The physicians barely looked at him before declaring him vigorous and well-formed, showing no signs of physical inadequacy. No invasive procedures, no detailed measurements, no hour-long humiliation, just a quick visual inspection and a declaration of perfect health. The contrast couldn't have been more stark. Catherine had endured over an hour of invasive examination with every intimate detail recorded. Lusignan got a cursory glance and immediate approval. The message was clear. When women's bodies were examined, it was to find fault. When men's bodies were examined, it was to confirm their adequacy. With both examinations complete, the court moved to witness testimony. This is where things got even worse for Catherine. Medieval trials for maleficium required testimony about the specific circumstances of the alleged witchcraft. In practice, this meant that servants who had been present during the bedding ceremony were called to describe, in explicit detail, what they had seen and heard on Catherine's wedding night. 3 chambermaids testified about preparing Catherine for bed. They described how she had seemed nervous but compliant, how she had worn the traditional white nightgown, how she had said prayers before Lusignan entered the chamber. Then came testimony from male servants who had been stationed outside the bedchamber door, supposedly to ensure privacy, but actually to listen for sounds that would confirm consummation had occurred. These servants described hearing Lusignan's voice, raised in anger multiple times throughout the night. They heard furniture being moved. They heard what sounded like arguing. But they heard nothing that suggested successful intercourse. One servant testified that at one point, Lusignan had stormed out of the bedchamber, demanded wine, drank an entire pitcher, and returned. Another said they heard Lusignan shouting accusations at Catherine, calling her a demon's vessel and a cursed woman. The most damaging testimony came from an elderly servant woman who claimed she had found evidence of witchcraft the morning after the wedding night. She testified that while cleaning the bedchamber, she discovered a small cloth pouch containing herbs tucked under the mattress. When asked what kind of herbs, she couldn't say. When asked how she knew they were meant for witchcraft rather than common remedies for wedding night nervousness, she claimed, "Women know these things." Catherine's lawyers challenged this testimony, pointing out that the pouch had mysteriously disappeared and couldn't be examined. They argued that even if herbs had been found, there was no proof Catherine had placed them there. Any servant could have planted evidence. But Bishop de Valois dismissed these objections, stating that the testimony of a God-fearing servant woman carried more weight than legal technicalities. Throughout all of this testimony, one crucial fact was never addressed. Lusignan himself had never been questioned under oath about what actually happened in that bedchamber. He had made accusations, demanded Catherine's examination, and positioned himself as the wronged party. But he had never provided specific testimony about his own actions or his own body's responses. The trial was structured so that Catherine's body and behavior were under constant scrutiny, while Lusignan's remained unexamined. As the testimony phase concluded, the court moved toward its inevitable conclusion. Bishop de Valois announced that additional questioning would be required. Specifically, Catherine would need to undergo interrogation under enhanced measures, medieval legal terminology for torture. The logic was simple and circular. If Catherine continued to deny using witchcraft, then she was lying and needed to be tortured until she confessed. If she confessed under torture, that proved the witchcraft accusations were true. Catherine's family made one final desperate attempt to save her. They offered Lusignan an enormous sum of money to drop the charges and agree to a quiet annulment. They even offered to take Catherine back and forfeit the entire dowry. But Lusignan refused. He had committed too fully to his narrative. Backing down now would raise questions about why he had pursued the trial so aggressively if he didn't truly believe his wife was a witch. The court scheduled Catherine's enhanced interrogation for the following week. Medieval torture methods for suspected witches were specifically designed to target women's bodies. Catherine would be stripped naked again, this time to be subjected to painful procedures meant to force a confession. And once she confessed, because everyone eventually confessed under medieval torture, she would be sentenced to death by burning. All of this horror, all of this legal machinery, all of this public humiliation existed for one purpose: to allow a powerful nobleman to avoid admitting that his body had failed him on his wedding night. Lusignan would rather torture and kill a teenage girl than face the embarrassment of acknowledging his own impotence. The trial had established one thing beyond doubt: Catherine's body was healthy and normal. But that fact, which should have exonerated her, became further evidence in Lusignan's narrative. If her body was normal, and his body was normal, then the only explanation for his failure must be supernatural interference. Logic itself had been twisted to serve his need to blame anyone but himself. As Catherine was led back to her locked chamber to await torture, the real nightmare was just beginning. Because medieval law didn't just allow husbands to accuse wives of witchcraft, it actively encouraged it. And once torture began, the only way out was confession, trial, and execution. Catherine was trapped in a legal system designed to destroy women who inconvenienced powerful men. And Lusignan was counting on that system to solve his problem permanently. The torture chamber was called a medical examination room. The instruments were called therapeutic devices, and the men who operated them were called physicians, not torturers. Medieval Europe had perfected the art of inflicting pain while maintaining the fiction of legitimate authority. What happened to Catherine over the next 3 weeks was officially recorded as medical treatment designed to cure her of demonic influence and restore her ability to fulfill her wifely duties. The first procedure involved bloodletting. Medieval physicians believed that witchcraft corrupted the blood, and that draining contaminated blood would purge demonic influence. Catherine was strapped to a wooden table while physicians opened veins in her arms and neck, letting blood drain into collection bowls. They took enough blood to leave her weak and dizzy, then waited 3 days for her body to recover before repeating the process. This happened 5 times over 2 weeks. Between bloodletting sessions, Catherine was subjected to what physicians called purgative treatments. She was forced to drink concoctions made from herbs, animal parts, and chemicals designed to induce violent vomiting and diarrhea. The theory was that demons hiding inside the body would be expelled along with bodily waste. In practice, this meant Catherine spent days in agony, her body racked with convulsions, unable to keep down food or water, growing weaker with each treatment. But the real horror was what they did to her reproductive organs. Medieval medicine had specific protocols for treating women accused of using sexual witchcraft. Physicians believed that demons could hide in the womb and vagina, preventing proper sexual function. The cure involved inserting caustic substances directly into these areas to burn out the demonic presence. Catherine was held down by 4 male attendants while physicians inserted instruments soaked in mixtures containing vinegar, crushed peppers, and ground mineral compounds. The pain was indescribable. The caustic solutions burned her internal tissues, causing damage that would never fully heal. She screamed until her voice gave out. The physicians recorded her screaming as evidence that demons were being expelled. When she stopped screaming, they interpreted her silence as stubborn resistance and applied the treatments more aggressively. Throughout all of this, Lusignan was present. He didn't perform the procedures himself, but he attended every session, watching from a corner of the room. Court records show that he frequently interrupted to give the physicians instructions. He wanted them to be more forceful. He complained when Catherine lost consciousness, demanding they revive her so the treatments could continue. He was determined to break her completely. The physicians kept detailed records of every procedure. These documents, preserved in church archives, make for horrifying reading. They describe Catherine's physical deterioration in clinical language that barely masks the brutality of what was being done to her. After 2 weeks of treatments, she had lost significant weight. Her menstrual cycle had stopped. She had developed infections from the invasive procedures. She could barely walk without assistance. Yet the physicians declared the treatments a success. According to their medical reasoning, Catherine's weakened state proved that demonic influence was being purged from her body. The fact that she was now too weak to resist anything was interpreted as spiritual improvement. They wrote in their reports that Catherine was responding well to treatment and showed signs of demonic influence diminishing. Then came the pregnancy. Sometime during the 4th week of Catherine's imprisonment and medical torture, she realized she was pregnant. The timing made it clear this had happened before the wedding, which was medically impossible since Catherine had been a virgin. But medieval medicine had an explanation for this too: succubus conception. Physicians theorized that demons could impregnate women without physical intercourse, creating demonic offspring. Catherine tried to explain that the pregnancy was impossible, that she had been a virgin at her wedding, that something else must be happening. But her protests were recorded as more evidence of demonic possession. A virgin bride suddenly pregnant after weeks of failed consummation. Obviously the work of demons. The physicians concluded that Catherine must have engaged in sexual acts with demonic entities, which both explained her pregnancy and proved the witchcraft accusations against her. The reality was almost certainly much darker. Catherine had been held in a castle surrounded by male guards and attendants, subjected to invasive physical examinations and procedures, rendered weak and helpless by medical torture. She had been completely vulnerable. And medieval castles were places where powerful men could do whatever they wanted to powerless women without consequence. But acknowledging that Catherine might have been raped by someone in Lusignan's household would have complicated his narrative. It would have raised questions about security, supervision, and Lusignan's responsibility for what happened to his wife while she was in his custody. So instead, the pregnancy was blamed on demons. Catherine went from being accused of using witchcraft to prevent consummation to being accused of having sex with demons. Either way, she was guilty. Lusignan's reaction to the pregnancy announcement revealed his true priorities. He didn't express concern for his wife's condition or confusion about how this could have happened. Instead, he immediately demanded that the pregnancy be terminated and used as evidence in the witchcraft trial. A pregnancy resulting from demonic intercourse was proof of Catherine's guilt and justified her execution. Medieval law technically prohibited executing pregnant women, but Lusignan had a solution. The pregnancy would be terminated through additional medical procedures, and then Catherine would be tried for both witchcraft and the separate crime of fornication with demons. The penalty for both crimes was death by burning. Lusignan had found a way to guarantee Catherine's execution while also explaining away his own sexual failure. The physicians prepared to terminate Catherine's pregnancy using methods that were brutal even by medieval standards. But before they could begin, something unexpected happened. Catherine's family, who had been frantically searching for legal options, found one. They petitioned the King of France directly, bypassing the ecclesiastical court and appealing to royal authority. The petition argued that Lusignan had violated proper legal procedure by holding the trial in his own castle with his own paid officials. It pointed out that the physicians treating Catherine were on Lusignan's payroll and had financial incentive to support his accusations. It demanded that Catherine be transferred to a neutral location for proper examination by independent medical authorities. And it included sworn testimony from servants in Lusignan's household, suggesting that Catherine had been assaulted. The king's response took 3 weeks to arrive. During that time, Catherine remained imprisoned, though the most aggressive medical treatments were suspended pending royal decision. Lusignan used this time to pressure Catherine directly. He visited her cell multiple times, offering her a deal: confess to witchcraft, accept annulment of the marriage, and he would arrange for her to be exiled to a convent instead of executed. She would lose everything, but she would live. Catherine refused. She maintained her innocence and demanded a fair trial. This decision was either incredibly brave or incredibly foolish, depending on how you looked at it. She was betting her life on the king's intervention, on the slim chance that royal authority would override a powerful nobleman's determination to destroy her. Most people in her situation would have taken the deal and spent the rest of their lives locked in a convent. Catherine chose to fight. When the king's response finally arrived, it was not what Catherine's family had hoped for. The king acknowledged irregularities in the trial proceedings, but declined to overturn the ecclesiastical court's authority. However, he did order that Catherine be examined by royal physicians before any sentence was carried out. This was a compromise that satisfied no one but kept everyone involved from losing face. The examination by royal physicians was scheduled for the following month. In the meantime, Catherine would remain in Lusignan's custody, though under stricter supervision. The medical torture was officially suspended. But Catherine was now 5 weeks pregnant, sick from the treatments she had already endured, and trapped in a castle with a man who desperately wanted her dead. Lusignan's reaction to the king's compromise was telling. He didn't accept it as a reasonable middle ground. Instead, he became more aggressive in his public statements about Catherine's guilt. He gave speeches to other nobles about the dangers of allowing witchcraft to go unpunished. He pressured church officials to condemn Catherine before the royal examination could take place. He was trying to create such strong public opinion against Catherine that the king's physicians would have no choice but to confirm the witchcraft diagnosis. As Catherine waited for the royal examination, her health continued to deteriorate. The pregnancy was advancing, but her body was too damaged and malnourished to support it properly. She developed complications that medieval medicine couldn't understand or treat. The castle physicians, still on Lusignan's payroll, recorded her symptoms but provided minimal care. They were waiting to see what the king's physicians would decide before committing to any treatment plan. The truly horrifying part was that everyone involved knew Catherine was probably going to die regardless of what the royal examination concluded. If found guilty of witchcraft, she would be executed. If found innocent, she would still be too physically damaged to survive much longer. The medical torture had destroyed her body. The pregnancy in her weakened state was likely to be fatal, and the infections from the invasive procedures were spreading. Lusignan had achieved his goal through a different method than he had planned. He had wanted Catherine legally executed as a witch, which would have given him a clean narrative and freed him to remarry without stigma. Instead, he had created a situation where Catherine would probably die from medical complications, which would also free him to remarry, but with a slightly messier explanation. Either way, his wife would be dead, and his sexual failure would be buried along with her body. The royal physicians arrived at Lusignan's castle on a cold morning in late autumn. There were 3 of them, appointed directly by the king's court and theoretically neutral in the matter of Catherine's guilt or innocence. Their job was to conduct a thorough medical examination and determine whether Catherine showed evidence of demonic possession, witchcraft, or natural illness that could explain the failed consummation and subsequent pregnancy. The examination took place over 2 days. Unlike the brutal invasive procedures Catherine had endured from Lusignan's physicians, the royal doctors were more methodical and less deliberately cruel. They questioned Catherine extensively about her medical history, the circumstances of her marriage, and the treatments she had received. They examined her body carefully, documenting injuries, infections, and signs of malnutrition. They consulted with midwives about the pregnancy and its viability. Their findings were damning, but not in the way Lusignan had hoped. The royal physicians concluded that Catherine showed no evidence of supernatural influence or demonic possession. The herbs allegedly found under her mattress, which had never been properly examined, were dismissed as unreliable evidence. Catherine's physical condition was attributed entirely to the medical treatment she had received, not to any inherent corruption or witchcraft. However, the physicians also noted something that would seal Catherine's fate. They could not definitively determine how she had become pregnant. Medieval medical knowledge couldn't date a pregnancy accurately enough to prove whether conception had occurred before or after the wedding. The physicians acknowledged that Catherine claimed to have been a virgin at marriage and that Lusignan claimed they had never successfully consummated the union, but pregnancy was undeniable physical evidence. Their official report included a careful political conclusion. They stated that while they found no evidence of witchcraft, they also could not rule it out entirely. The pregnancy under impossible circumstances suggested supernatural intervention, though whether this was caused by Catherine's actions or by malevolent forces acting upon her remained unclear. In other words, they were passing the decision back to the ecclesiastical court while covering themselves legally. This was exactly the opening Lusignan needed. The royal physicians hadn't exonerated Catherine. They had simply said they couldn't prove anything definitively. In medieval legal thinking, this ambiguity favored the accuser, not the accused. Lusignan immediately petitioned the ecclesiastical court to resume proceedings based on the royal physician's acknowledgement that supernatural influence remained possible. Bishop de Valois reconvened the court within days. The proceedings moved with suspicious speed, suggesting the outcome had been predetermined. Catherine, now visibly pregnant and still weak from her medical torture, was brought before the court to hear the verdict. She could barely stand without support. Her family had been forbidden from attending. The courtroom was filled with Lusignan's allies and associates. The bishop read the court's decision. Based on the totality of evidence, including Catherine's inability to consummate her marriage, the mysterious appearance of herbs in her bedchamber, and most importantly, her pregnancy under impossible circumstances, the court found her guilty of practicing maleficium, harmful magic directed at preventing lawful marital relations. The sentence was death by burning, to be carried out after the pregnancy was terminated. Catherine tried to speak in her own defense, but the bishop cut her off. He declared that the sentence would be stayed temporarily to allow for the pregnancy termination, which would be performed by physicians under church supervision. After the termination, Catherine would have 1 week to confess her sins and receive last rites. Then she would be executed in the castle courtyard. But Lusignan wasn't satisfied with just winning the trial. He wanted Catherine's death to serve as a warning to other women who might consider using witchcraft against their husbands. He petitioned the court for permission to personally oversee the execution, arguing that as the wronged husband, he had the right to ensure justice was properly administered. The bishop approved his request. The pregnancy termination took place 3 days later. Medieval medical procedures for forced termination were primitive and dangerous. Physicians gave Catherine drugs to induce contractions and used instruments to physically remove the fetus. The process took hours and caused massive internal bleeding. Catherine survived, but barely. The physicians reported that she likely had only days or weeks to live even without the scheduled execution. During the week between the termination and her scheduled execution, Catherine was kept in a cell beneath the castle. She was given minimal food and no medical care for the injuries from the termination procedure. Lusignan visited her twice during this time, not to offer comfort, but to demand that she publicly confess to witchcraft. He wanted her final statement to validate his accusations and clear his reputation completely. Catherine refused both times. Even facing death, even broken and bleeding, she would not confess to crimes she hadn't committed. This infuriated Lusignan more than anything else that had happened during the entire ordeal. Her continued insistence on innocence was an implicit accusation against him. If she wasn't a witch, then his failure to consummate the marriage was his own failing, not supernatural interference. On the morning of the execution, Catherine was carried from her cell to the castle courtyard. She was too weak to walk. A crowd had gathered, including many of Lusignan's noble friends and associates. This wasn't just an execution, it was a social event. People had traveled from neighboring estates to witness the burning of a noble lady convicted of witchcraft. The execution method Lusignan chose was deliberately cruel. Standard burning at the stake involved tying the condemned person to a wooden post and building a fire around them. The smoke and heat would typically cause unconsciousness before the flames caused fatal burns. But Lusignan ordered a different setup. Catherine would be placed in an iron cage suspended above the fire, meaning she would die slowly from heat and smoke inhalation, rather than being quickly consumed by flames. Catherine was lifted into the cage and secured. She didn't struggle. She was too weak and too resigned to what was coming. The priest offered final prayers, which she accepted. Then Lusignan himself lit the kindling at the base of the pyre. He wanted everyone to see him taking direct action against the witch who had cursed his marriage. The fire took a long time to build. Medieval executions weren't the quick deaths shown in movies. They were prolonged, agonizing deaths that could last for hours. As the flames grew and the heat intensified, Catherine remained conscious. People in the crowd reported that she never screamed. She either stayed silent or had lost the ability to make sound. Some interpreted her silence as demonic defiance. Others wondered if she was already dead from her injuries and the fire was burning a corpse. 40 minutes after the fire was lit, Catherine stopped moving. The crowd began to disperse. Lusignan remained, watching until the flames died down and nothing remained but bones and ashes. He had successfully eliminated his wife, avoided admitting his own sexual inadequacy, and maintained his reputation as a noble lord wronged by witchcraft. In medieval legal terms, he had won completely. Catherine's family attempted to claim her remains for burial, but Lusignan refused. He ordered the ashes scattered to prevent any shrine or memorial. He wanted Catherine erased from history as thoroughly as she had been erased from life. Within a month, he began negotiating a second marriage. Within 6 months, he was married again. The truly chilling detail that emerged years later, long after Lusignan's death, was what happened with his second wife. Her name was Marie, and she was 18 when they married. The marriage lasted 8 months before Marie was found dead in her bedchamber. The official cause of death was recorded as sudden illness, but servants whispered about suspicious circumstances. Marie had been healthy one day and dead the next, with no clear medical explanation. Lusignan's neighbors and fellow nobles began to notice a pattern, but nobody was willing to confront a powerful lord over his marital difficulties. Some privately speculated that Lusignan had the same sexual problems with Marie that he'd had with Catherine, and that he had once again chosen to eliminate his wife rather than admit failure. But without proof, and without anyone willing to testify against a well-connected nobleman, nothing was done. The murder disguised as execution had been so successful the first time that Lusignan apparently felt confident using similar methods again. Medieval society had handed him the perfect tool for disposing of inconvenient wives, accusations of witchcraft backed by medical torture and ecclesiastical authority. As long as he maintained his reputation and his political connections, he could kill with legal impunity. Catherine's execution wasn't just the death of one woman. It was a demonstration of how medieval legal and medical systems could be weaponized by powerful men to destroy women who inconvenienced them. Every procedural safeguard had failed. The church court was corrupt. The physicians were bought. The royal intervention was meaningless, and public opinion sided with the nobleman rather than his teenage bride. The truly horrifying part wasn't that Lusignan killed his wife. It was that he did it legally, with the full support of medieval law, and faced no consequences. In fact, he was praised by many of his peers for his firm handling of a dangerous witch. The system worked exactly as designed, to protect powerful men and dispose of powerless women. Marie de Bourbon was 19 years old when her family arranged her marriage to the Lord of Lusignan. She came from minor nobility, not as prestigious as Catherine's family, but respectable enough. Her dowry was substantial, though not exceptional. What made her an attractive match for Lusignan was her family's desperation. They had 3 daughters and limited resources. Marrying Marie to a wealthy lord, even one with a dark history, seemed like their best option. Lusignan had been careful about managing his reputation after Catherine's execution. He made generous donations to the church. He attended religious services regularly. He cultivated relationships with powerful nobles and positioned himself as a victim of witchcraft who had been forced to take drastic action to protect himself and his household. Most people either believed his story or found it politically convenient to pretend they did. Marie's family knew about Catherine. Everyone in the region knew about Catherine. But Lusignan's version of events had become the accepted narrative. A noble lord had married a woman who turned out to be a witch. She had used dark magic against him and paid the lawful penalty for her crimes. It was a tragic story, certainly, but one that reflected well on Lusignan's decisive leadership and moral clarity. Or so the official story went. The wedding took place in spring, a year and 4 months after Catherine's execution. It was a smaller affair than Lusignan's first wedding, with fewer guests and less elaborate ceremony. Marie's family couldn't afford the kind of spectacular celebration that Catherine's family had provided. The bedding ceremony was performed, but with notable differences. Fewer witnesses, less fanfare. A sense of everyone involved wanting to get through the formalities as quickly as possible. The morning after the wedding night, Lusignan emerged from the bedchamber with a familiar expression. Not rage this time, but something colder, resignation mixed with calculation. He spoke briefly with his closest advisors before leaving the castle for 3 days to attend to business on his estates. Marie remained in the bedchamber, and servants reported that she seemed confused and distressed, but wouldn't explain what had happened. When Lusignan returned, he didn't immediately accuse Marie of witchcraft. He had learned from his experience with Catherine that public accusations drew unwanted attention and complicated legal proceedings. Instead, he began a quieter campaign of psychological destruction. He told Marie privately that she had failed him, that something was wrong with her, that she needed to fix herself before he would touch her again. Marie spent the next 2 months in a state of anxious confusion. She consulted with older women about how to please her husband. She prayed constantly. She tried different perfumes and clothing. She did everything medieval advice suggested for winning a husband's affection. Nothing worked. Lusignan remained distant and critical, occasionally visiting her chambers only to leave again after brief, uncomfortable encounters that never resulted in consummation. The castle staff began to notice disturbing patterns. Lusignan would summon Marie to private meetings where he would berate her for hours about her inadequacy. He would compare her unfavorably to other women, including, ironically, to Catherine, whom he now described as having been beautiful and desirable before she became corrupted by demonic influence. He was systematically breaking down Marie's confidence and self-worth. 3 months into the marriage, Marie began showing physical symptoms of stress. She lost weight. She developed a nervous habit of picking at her hands until they bled. She stopped sleeping properly. The castle physician, the same man who had participated in Catherine's medical torture, examined her and declared she was suffering from hysteria brought on by guilt. Guilt about what, he didn't specify, but the implication was clear. Lusignan began spending more time away from the castle. He would leave for weeks at a time, offering vague explanations about business matters or hunting trips. During these absences, Marie was confined to her chambers. Servants brought her food and ensured she had basic necessities, but she was essentially a prisoner. Lusignan claimed this was for her own protection, that she was too fragile and hysterical to be allowed freedom of movement. When Lusignan was present, he subjected Marie to the same pattern of psychological abuse. Private meetings where he detailed her failures, public coldness that humiliated her in front of the household, occasional brief visits to her bedchamber that never resulted in successful consummation and always ended with him leaving in apparent frustration. Marie began to believe that she really was defective, that something fundamental was wrong with her body or soul. 6 months into the marriage, Marie made a desperate decision. She confided in an older servant woman about her situation, asking for advice about how to fix whatever was wrong with her. The servant, who had been at the castle during Catherine's ordeal, recognized the pattern immediately. She tried to warn Marie that the problem wasn't with her, that Lusignan was using the same tactics he had used before, that Marie needed to protect herself. But Marie didn't understand. She had been so thoroughly convinced of her own inadequacy that she couldn't accept the possibility that Lusignan was lying. When the servant suggested that Marie's family should be contacted, Marie refused. She was ashamed of her failure as a wife and didn't want her family to know how badly things had gone. This isolation was exactly what Lusignan needed. 7 months into the marriage, Marie developed what the castle physician described as a serious illness. She began running fevers. She experienced severe abdominal pain. She couldn't keep food down. The physician prescribed various remedies, none of which helped. Marie grew weaker by the day. Lusignan, when informed of his wife's condition, showed minimal concern. He visited her sick room once, stayed for less than 5 minutes, and then returned to his own chambers. The nature of Marie's illness was suspicious to anyone paying attention. The symptoms appeared suddenly in a previously healthy young woman. They worsened rapidly despite medical treatment, and they matched the symptoms of several known poisons, particularly arsenic, which was readily available in medieval households and frequently used for pest control. But the castle physician, loyal to Lusignan, recorded the illness as natural causes brought on by hysteria and weak feminine constitution. Marie's family, alerted by a concerned servant, traveled to the castle to see their daughter. They were shocked by her condition. She had lost significant weight and could barely stay conscious for more than a few minutes at a time. They demanded better medical care and suggested moving Marie back to their estate where she could be nursed properly. Lusignan refused, claiming that moving her in her weakened state would be dangerous and that she was receiving the best possible care at his castle. 3 days after her family's visit, Marie died. She was 19 years old and had been married for 8 months. The official cause of death was recorded as acute illness of unknown origin, complicated by hysteria and melancholia. Her body was prepared for burial quickly. before her family could request an examination. Lusignan organized a modest funeral and appeared appropriately grieved in public. Marie's family suspected foul play but had no proof and no political power to challenge a lord as well connected as Lusignan. They took their daughter's body home for burial and tried to move on with their lives, but whispers began to circulate among the regional nobility. 2 wives, 2 mysterious outcomes. One burned as a witch after a public trial. One dead of sudden illness after months of isolation and psychological abuse. The pattern was becoming difficult to ignore. Some nobles began to distance themselves from Lusignan socially. Not openly, because that would require explaining their suspicions, but subtly. Invitations became less frequent. Political alliances became more tentative. Marriage negotiations with families who had eligible daughters went nowhere. Lusignan's reputation was starting to crack, but only in private conversations and unspoken social snubs. Lusignan responded to this social cooling by becoming more aggressive in defending his honor. He gave speeches about the challenges of finding a suitable wife in an age when women were increasingly corrupted by modern ideas and insufficient religious devotion. He positioned himself as a victim of circumstance, a noble lord who had suffered tremendous personal losses through no fault of his own. Some people found this convincing. Others found it disturbing. What nobody knew at the time, what wouldn't be discovered until years later, was that Lusignan had kept detailed private records of both marriages. He had written letters to confidants describing his frustrations and his plans. These documents, found after his death, revealed the calculated nature of his actions and his awareness that he was eliminating wives who had become inconvenient. But in the immediate aftermath of Marie's death, Lusignan appeared to be getting away with murder again. The legal system had accepted the official explanation. The church had performed the funeral rites without question. Marie's family had taken their grief home and caused no public trouble. Lusignan was free to marry again if he chose, though he would need to be more careful about selecting a bride whose family wouldn't ask uncomfortable questions. The truly horrifying realization was that medieval society had no mechanism for stopping men like Lusignan. Even when patterns became obvious, even when multiple wives died under suspicious circumstances, the system prioritized protecting noble privilege over investigating noble crimes. A lord's reputation and political connections mattered more than dead women whose families couldn't prove foul play. Marie's death was quieter than Catherine's execution, but no less calculated. Lusignan had learned that public spectacles drew attention and scrutiny. Quiet poisonings in isolated circumstances were much harder to investigate and much easier to explain away as natural illness. He had refined his technique, and there was nothing to stop him from using it again. The Lord of Lusignan never married a third time, not because he had developed a conscience or because social pressure finally forced him to stop. He simply ran out of time. 3 years after Marie's death, Lusignan began experiencing symptoms that no amount of money or political influence could make disappear. It started with painful sores that appeared on his genitals and wouldn't heal. Medieval physicians had limited understanding of sexually transmitted diseases. They knew that certain illnesses could be passed through sexual contact, but they couldn't identify specific diseases or provide effective treatments. When Lusignan first consulted physicians about his condition, they offered various explanations: bad humors, corruption of the blood, divine punishment for sins. None of their treatments worked. The sores spread and worsened. Within 6 months, Lusignan's condition had progressed dramatically. The genital sores had become open, weeping ulcers that produced a constant foul-smelling discharge. He developed lesions on other parts of his body. His hair began falling out in patches. He experienced severe joint pain that made walking difficult, and most ironically, given his history, his genitals began to deteriorate visibly. Modern medical experts who have examined historical descriptions of Lusignan's symptoms agree that he was suffering from advanced syphilis. The disease had probably been present in his body for years, possibly even before his marriages to Catherine and Marie. This meant that his sexual dysfunction, the problem he had blamed on witchcraft and used as justification for destroying 2 women, had been caused by his own diseased body all along. The progression of untreated syphilis in the medieval period was horrific. Without antibiotics, the disease moved through its stages relentlessly. After the initial sores came a period where symptoms seemed to improve, lulling victims into thinking they were recovering. But the disease was actually spreading throughout the body, attacking organs and tissues. By the time Lusignan sought medical help, he was already in the tertiary stage where the damage was irreversible. Lusignan tried to keep his condition secret, but that became impossible as the visible symptoms worsened. The lesions on his face and hands couldn't be hidden. The smell from his infected genitals was noticeable to anyone who came near him. His personality began to change as the disease attacked his brain, causing mood swings, paranoia, and periods of confusion. The powerful lord who had once commanded respect became a grotesque figure that servants whispered about in horrified tones. The castle physician, who had served Lusignan so loyally during Catherine's torture and Marie's poisoning, now found himself treating a patient whose condition was beyond medieval medical knowledge. He tried everything: bloodletting, purgatives, application of mercury compounds directly to the sores. The mercury treatments were particularly agonizing and only made things worse, causing additional tissue damage and mercury poisoning on top of the syphilis. Lusignan's final year was spent in increasing isolation and agony. He could no longer participate in noble social life because his appearance and smell made him unwelcome. He could barely walk due to joint deterioration and lesions on his feet. His mental state deteriorated to the point where he would have periods of lucidity followed by hours of raving confusion. During his lucid moments, he allegedly spoke obsessively about his wives and insisted he had done nothing wrong. The genital damage was particularly extensive. Historical medical records describe his penis and testicles as essentially rotting away while he was still alive. The infection had destroyed so much tissue that what remained barely resembled functioning anatomy. The physicians who examined him in his final months noted that his reproductive organs were completely non-functional and had probably been diseased and partially non-functional for many years before his condition became obvious. This medical documentation revealed the terrible irony at the heart of Lusignan's story. The sexual dysfunction that had triggered his destruction of Catherine had been real, but it had been caused by his own diseased body, not by witchcraft. His inability to consummate his marriages was a symptom of advancing syphilis, not supernatural interference. He had tortured and killed Catherine to cover up a medical problem that was entirely his own fault. The discovery of his condition also raised disturbing questions about how Lusignan had contracted syphilis in the first place. The disease required sexual contact to spread. Lusignan's marriages had not been consummated, yet he clearly had advanced syphilis that had been progressing for years. The most likely explanation was that he had been visiting prostitutes or engaging in extramarital sexual activity before and during his marriages. He had infected himself, then blamed his wives for the consequences. As Lusignan's death approached, his body became a horror show that even medieval physicians found disturbing. The genital rot had spread to his lower abdomen. The lesions on his body had opened into deep wounds that wouldn't heal. His bones were visible through deteriorated skin in some places. The smell was so overpowering that servants had to wear herb-soaked cloths over their faces when attending to him. He was essentially decomposing while still alive. His mental deterioration in the final weeks was equally grotesque. He would scream about demons and witches. He would accuse servants of trying to poison him. He would demand that physicians bring him young women to prove he was still capable of sex, apparently unable to recognize that his genitals had rotted beyond any possible function. These demands were recorded by physicians as evidence of how disease had corrupted his mind. The Lord of Lusignan died in his bed, alone except for a priest and 2 servants. The date was November 18th, 1317. He was 43 years old. His body was so deteriorated and infectious that the servants initially refused to prepare it for burial. The castle physician had to supervise the process and provide special instructions for handling the corpse safely. But here's where the story reaches its most grotesque and fitting conclusion. Because Lusignan was a lord, because he had political connections and had maintained enough of his reputation to warrant it, an autopsy was performed. This wasn't standard practice in medieval times, but Lusignan's family wanted documentation of his cause of death for inheritance and political reasons. What the autopsy revealed became a matter of horrified whispers throughout the region. The examining physicians wrote a detailed report that was preserved in church archives. They described opening Lusignan's body and finding extensive internal damage. His internal organs showed signs of advanced disease. His bones were pitted and damaged by infection. But the most shocking findings involved his reproductive organs. What remained of his penis and testicles was described as completely necrotic, blackened and rotted, with evidence that the tissue death had been progressing for many years. The physicians concluded that Lusignan had been suffering from advanced genital disease that would have made sexual function impossible for at least the final decade of his life. They noted that this condition would have been painful and obvious to anyone examining him, and that any physician who had examined him during his marriages would have been able to identify the problem. In other words, the medical professionals who had participated in torturing Catherine for alleged witchcraft would have known that Lusignan himself was the source of the sexual dysfunction. This revelation came too late to save Catherine or Marie, but it fundamentally changed how some people viewed the witchcraft trial. A few nobles who had supported Lusignan began to distance themselves from his memory. Some church officials who had presided over Catherine's execution expressed private doubts about whether justice had been served. The castle physician, who had participated in both women's destruction, disappeared from the region, possibly fleeing before questions could be asked about what he had known and when he had known it. But there was no formal investigation, no posthumous vindication for Catherine, no compensation for her family or Marie's family. The legal system that had enabled Lusignan's crimes had no mechanism for admitting its mistakes or punishing crimes that had been committed under legal authority. Lusignan's death closed the matter as far as official records were concerned. The final grotesque detail came from Lusignan's burial. Because of the extensive tissue damage and infection, his body continued to decompose rapidly, even after death. The coffin had to be sealed immediately, but that didn't stop the smell. His funeral was attended by fewer than 20 people, compared to hundreds who would normally attend a lord's funeral. Those who did attend reported that the stench was overwhelming even outside the church. Years after Lusignan's burial, his tomb began to develop cracks and leak foul-smelling fluids. The church where he was buried had to perform multiple repairs and eventually resealed the tomb completely to prevent the ongoing contamination. Local people began to whisper that Lusignan's corrupted body was polluting the sacred ground, that he had been so diseased and evil in life that even death couldn't contain the rot. The historical irony is perfect and terrible. Lusignan had spent his adult life blaming women for a sexual dysfunction that was entirely caused by his own diseased body. He had used medieval legal and medical systems to torture and kill wives who had done nothing wrong except marry a man whose body was already rotting from the inside out. And in the end, his own rotted genitals provided the proof that he had been the problem all along. Catherine had burned to death, accused of using magic to prevent sex. Marie had been poisoned, eliminated because she represented another failure Lusignan couldn't face. Both women had been destroyed by a man who blamed them for consequences of his own secret disease. Both women had been ground up by a legal system that prioritized protecting noble male privilege over seeking truth or justice. The Lord of Lusignan's story isn't just about one cruel man. It's about how medieval society was structured to allow men like him to destroy women with impunity. It's about how legal systems and medical authority could be weaponized against the powerless. It's about how easily truth could be buried under accusations of witchcraft when those accusations served the interests of powerful people. 2 women died because a diseased nobleman couldn't admit that his rotting genitals were his own fault. And the truly horrifying part is that this wasn't an exception to how medieval marriage law worked. It was the system functioning exactly as designed. Men with power could accuse. Women without power could die. And nobody in authority cared enough to question whether justice was being served. The Lord of Lusignan's rotting corpse leaking fluids through cracks in his tomb, poisoning the ground around his burial site, is a fitting metaphor for his legacy. He was corruption in human form, a man whose diseased body matched his diseased soul, whose death couldn't contain the damage he had done in life. And he got away with all of it, until syphilis finally destroyed him as thoroughly as he had destroyed the women who had the misfortune to marry him.